This is the first of several videos about the foreign policies of Poland and Germany in East and Central Europe throughout the last 50 years. At first, this was only supposed to be about Polish foreign policy, but then I decided to also add videos on German foreign policy, but the main focus is still on Poland. I'm doing this because I want to compare the foreign policies of both countries, primarily Ostpolitik, a German foreign policy initiative that started in the 1960s and focused on building relations with communist bloc countries, and the Polish realism of Jerzy Giedroyc, which focused on securing Poland among newfound allies in a post-communist world. These are two foreign policy ideas with both failures and successes on their record that, in my opinion, lend themselves really well for comparison. By putting them next to each other, I think I will be able to point out to you how good foreign policy and bad foreign policy is made, how we come up with foreign policy ideas, and why some succeed while others fail. This video that you are watching here right now is about the origins and initial successes of German Ostpolitik, where it came from and what shaped it, how it initially succeeded and why throughout the 1960s and 1970s. Over the course of the next 4 videos on this channel, you will see the origins of Polish realism in the Polish exile and anti-communist dissident movements, how German Ostpolitik failed, how Polish realism succeeded in the Baltic states with the Americans and the Visegrad group states, and how Polish realism failed with Russia and Belarus while succeeding with Ukraine, and how as a result of this successful foreign policy, it significantly strengthened Poland within Europe. Then I might make a final video where we go through the lessons we can learn from comparing the two. Since 2022, Poland has become one of the linchpins in European foreign and defense policy. What decisions are made in Warsaw now have increasingly more impact throughout the rest of Europe and will shape the future of Europe for decades to come. And therefore, following the news from Poland will be more important, and being aware of the biases in reporting on Poland will be also very important. Because with how much influence Poland has gained in Europe in recent years, it is appropriate to see Warsaw in European politics on an equal standing as Berlin and Paris by now. What is decided in Warsaw will impact all of us increasingly. That means many things. I believe Poland is likely going to be a more conservative influence in Europe that prioritizes European defense and economic deregulation. Poland, for example, recently scrapped anti-GMO patent laws, which is a significant step in a Europe that largely legislates against GMOs. Another recent news item, largely overlooked in Western Europe, is that the Baltic states have recently cut their electrical grids completely off from Russia and deepened their cooperation with Poland in energy infrastructure. These kinds of stories are often not reported by mainstream media, that in some ways still ignores news items from these countries. And that is exactly why I like using ground news to stay informed and make these videos, in my research and as a sponsor. Since a lot of stories coming out of Poland may get lost in translation, even though they may impact the rest of Europe. And the Ground News Blind Spot feed surfaces important stories like these. In December, the United States opened a missile base in northern Poland, and Russia responded with nuclear threats. On Ground News, you are able to see how different news outlets covered this story. With Ground News, we can see that over 50% of the coverage on this story is coming from the right. And it is noticeable that despite the differences in left and right, European media is almost unified in its support of Poland and condemnation of Russian threats, from the left-leaning Daily Mirror to the conservative Telegraph. While the only news outlet that lies outside of this bipartisan consensus is the Saudi outlet Al Arabiya, who blame the United States and the American-Polish alliance and frame it as a threat to the world. I have worked with Ground News for over 2 years now and have over that time come to rely more and more on what they provide and find them more and more important, so I encourage you to check them out. My viewers can save 40% off unlimited access by scanning the QR code on the screen or go to ground.news/Kraut. The link is in the description, and many thanks to Ground News. I am pretty sure that everyone in the audience who has read up on foreign policy in any capacity is aware of what Ostpolitik is, but for those of you who don't know, it was basically a foreign policy of approaching the Eastern Bloc during the Cold War, which was mainly pushed and conducted by Germany. Ostpolitik is the brainchild of two prominent German political figures, Egon Bahr and Willy Brandt. We mainly associate Ostpolitik with Willy Brandt, since he was the Chancellor of Germany when Ostpolitik became German foreign policy. But if we are honest, the brains behind Ostpolitik, who laid out its methods and goals, was Egon Bahr. After the Second World War, two Germanys emerged. The initial relations between the two were a shit show. They both denied each other's existence, each other's legitimacy, and kept raging at each other. A good example of this would be the Hallstein Doctrine, which mandated that West Germany would sanction any nation that recognized the GDR. The conservative German government of Adenauer officially pursued a policy called Magnettheorie, or magnet theory, throughout the 1950s. The idea behind it was that a democratic, open and prosperous West Germany would over time succeed and become so prosperous and attractive that it would attract East Germans to it. Gradually over time, this would lead to the erosion of the East German state. Therefore, East Germany could be diplomatically ignored. But the East Germans built a wall and shot those who tried to get to West Germany, making magnet theory a failure. Bahr observed these tensions, believed they were dangerous, and argued for a new approach based on 5 points in foreign policy. First, preventing a Third World War. Any border incidents between the two Germanys would not just concern West Germany alone, but had the potential of escalating into a full-on global nuclear war. Speaking to East Germany should therefore not be rejected on selfish nationalistic grounds of wanting a Germany that was unified, because any misstep could draw the entire world into conflict. West Germany therefore had a responsibility, not just to itself, but for the sake of the security of the whole world, to speak to East Germany. Second, accepting the status quo. Sulking in a corner because Germany was not unified was delusional. Reality does not change just because of one's wishful thinking. Continuing to reject that reality would only separate the two Germanys even more. Contact could facilitate exchange and ties. The division of Germany must therefore be accepted as a political reality, not because one wants it to be the reality, but because it simply is the reality. Third, talk for the sake of talking. It is important to talk to the East, even if there were two German states, in order to maintain one German society. Germans must be allowed to speak, interact, and know of each other at the very least. Fourth, reconciliation. Germany has done wrong. Now today we all know this, and it's not a controversial thing to say, but at the time, during the late 1950s and early 1960s, that was a very courageous thing for a German to say in Germany. The first German post-war governments, very reluctantly, if at all, admitted or apologized for any wrongdoing during the Nazi era and the Second World War. The general attitude was to attempt to sweep it all under a rug and go on with business as usual. The young Social Democrats emerging as party leaders in the early 1960s believed that this could not be continued. Germany must admit to the crimes of its past. It must face their consequences, and it must do what it can do to reconcile with her victims. Fifth, trade. In the 1950s, the German and French governments signed trade treaties opening up each other's markets. The purpose of these treaties was to interconnect the French and German economies to such an extent that war would be made impossible between the two. Similar policies should be pursued with the East. The foreign policy doctrine formulated out of these points was called Wandel durch Annäherung, change through approaching. In 1969, the SPD won the general election. Willy Brandt became Chancellor, and Wandel durch Annäherung became the new foreign policy priority of the German state, called Ostpolitik. It kicked off with Willy Brandt becoming the first German Chancellor to visit East Germany. This was first heavily criticized at home, but ended up being an enormous success for Brandt and even an embarrassment for the East German state, because Willy Brandt was greeted by cheering East German crowds who chanted his name. This meeting, even though the two states did not yet officially recognize each other, opened the first bilateral relations between the two German states. Later that year, Brandt went to Warsaw and Moscow. In Moscow, he signed a treaty recognizing the Soviet borders and obliging both signatories to cooperate in relaxing the tensions of the Cold War. But it is Brandt's trip to Warsaw that is far more famous. where he bowed on his knees before the memorial of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, recognized German responsibility for the crimes of the Second World War, and recognized the new Polish borders. He followed this up later in 1973 by becoming the first German chancellor to visit Israel and acknowledging the German responsibility for the Holocaust. But as much as these actions and policy initiatives are praised today, we should not forget something. This was widely controversial in Germany at the time. It caused protests and even riots. The conservative opposition had made it part of their party program that Kaliningrad, the Sudetenlands, Silesia, Gdansk and Pomerania, all of which were part of the Soviet Union, Poland and Czechoslovakia, must be returned to Germany. Brandt was branded a traitor who had sold Germany out. Brandt's recognition of German responsibility in the crimes of the Second World War was even more viciously attacked. The then leader of the CSU, Franz Josef Strauß, denounced him in a vicious speech, proclaiming that a nation like Germany need not take lectures on morality from Washington, Moscow or Tel Aviv. The anti-Semitic undertones of that speech, which elevated Tel Aviv to the same status as Washington and Moscow, and implied that Jews were pulling the strings of America, the Soviet Union and Brandt, were clearly meant to appeal to the old Nazis and rile them up against Brandt. The viciousness with which Brandt was attacked is largely forgotten today, but should not be forgotten. This period of Ostpolitik was successful, but it was viciously attacked and had to persevere against huge opposition. In 1972, Brandt received the Nobel Peace Prize in recognition of the success of Ostpolitik, and in 1972 signed an agreement with the East German state. That agreement did not yet result in the two states recognizing each other, but it opened up both states to engage in trade and transit. He won re-election and made his famous visit to Israel. Ostpolitik continued, and in 1973, West Germany and East Germany recognized each other as legitimate states. This allowed for the opening of embassies, the beginning of commercial ties, and formal relations between the two Germanys. The goals outlined by Egon Bahr over a decade before for reaching a diplomatic state of de-escalation of the Cold War, contact to enable de-escalation and exchange, and mutual recognition of a geopolitical reality had thereby been achieved. After this, Brandt's second term came to an abrupt end in 1974 when it was revealed that one of his secretaries was an East German spy. He consequently resigned. He was succeeded by Helmut Schmidt, who would continue Ostpolitik under its motto of Wandel durch Annäherung. But Ostpolitik was not Schmidt's main foreign policy priority. His main priority was the construction of the European project with the French. Schmidt can be considered one of the founding fathers of the modern European Union. Schmidt's main Ostpolitik success was the signing of the Treaty of Prague. In this document, Germany condemned the Munich Agreement of 1938 as criminal and invalid. Germany also forever renounced any claims to territory of Czechoslovakia, including the Sudetenland, and consequently, Czechoslovakia and Germany thereby formally recognized each other and their borders as legitimate and took up diplomatic relations. Schmidt also became the first German chancellor to visit Auschwitz and build deeper diplomatic ties to Poland. But as mentioned before, his main foreign policy priority was the European project. On East Germany, he mainly sought to maintain and continue the accomplishments of Brandt. Others took over initiative in the Cold War détente, mainly the Finnish president Urho Kekkonen. The culmination of this commitment was the Helsinki Conference, at which all European states, as well as the United States and Canada, signed an agreement for peace and security in Europe. Beginning in the late 1970s, the warmth of the Ostpolitik and Cold War détente began to cool down. The Soviet Union developed and began deploying medium-range nuclear missiles in Warsaw Pact countries. In response, Schmidt invited the United States to station medium-range nuclear missiles in West Germany. This was incredibly unpopular with his own party, and the German public in general. The Liberal Democrats, who were in coalition with the SPD, switched sides, voted to oust Schmidt in a vote of no confidence, and then went into coalition with the Conservatives, and Helmut Kohl became Chancellor. This, what I outlined here to you from 1969 to 1982, is the first phase, was the first phase of Ostpolitik, and it is widely regarded to be the most successful phase. Now that we have gone through the events in a timeline, I think it helps to take a step back and take an overview, but also an outside view. We should mainly ask one question: why was this first phase of Ostpolitik a success? I believe the main reason were the partners. You can have the greatest vision for a foreign policy idea. You can dream up what you may believe to be the best possible foreign policy ideas that have ever been. But if you are confronted with a foreign state that is non-cooperative, your ideas are worthless. The leaders and thinkers of Ostpolitik had the great fortune that they implemented their policies in a time where they had a partner who pursued similar goals: Leonid Brezhnev. Brezhnev was a traumatized World War II veteran who hated war. Brezhnev despised the aggressive foreign policy of his predecessors Stalin and Khrushchev that had driven East and West to the brink of war on several occasions. Brezhnev wanted to achieve an arms control treaty, a binding non-aggression pact between East and West, and possibly even a worldwide abolition of nuclear weapons. Brezhnev welcomed Ostpolitik as a means by which he could also promote his own foreign policy agenda. The success of Ostpolitik in the 1970s did, however, not just depend on the Soviet Union and its leadership. Germans today like to take credit for the success of Ostpolitik, but there's one important fact that should not be overlooked. Ostpolitik would have gone nowhere without the support of the Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme, Finnish President Urho Kekkonen, and Austrian Chancellor Bruno Kreisky. Palme, Brandt, and Kreisky were close friends. They supported Ostpolitik together as a means for achieving nuclear disarmament. They closely worked together in tandems, supporting each other's initiatives, tying the Swedish, German, and Austrian Social Democrats together in diplomatic efforts across Europe as well as in domestic politics. There's a reason why many European Social Democrats considered this time period, from the late 1960s to 1970s, the golden age of European social democracy. Outside of Ostpolitik, it succeeded in domestic policies of decriminalizing homosexuality, childcare, benefits for single mothers, legalizing abortion, and expanding healthcare for people with chronic illnesses, as well as tuition-free education. In foreign policy, the partnership was important in returning democracy to Spain, Portugal, and Greece after the end of their dictatorships in 1974-1975. Kreisky drove an initiative supported by Brandt and Palme to normalize and deepen relations between Europe and the former British and French colonies, mainly with India. They, but especially Palme, were the main force behind Europe imposing sanctions and boycotts on apartheid South Africa. They also failed on occasion. Kreisky tried to use his almost symbolic status as the first Jewish leader of a German-speaking country to try to negotiate peace between Israel and Palestine. But he failed when the PLO started committing terror attacks in Austria, which also ended Kreisky's project of building an active Austrian neutrality similar to that of Finland. All three of these social democratic leaders who came to power in the 1970s shared very much in common. Both Brandt and Kreisky had spent World War II in exile in Sweden, but in their youth they were also all active in socialist movements of the 1920s and 1930s. These movements, at that particular time, emphasized the importance of a so-called socialist international, of learning foreign languages and cooperating across nationalities. That framework was probably essential to their successes in the 1970s. Now, by the 1970s, they were all social democrats and no longer radical socialist revolutionaries, but they kept that framework that they had worked with in their youth of an international cooperation in foreign and domestic policy, and we can clearly see that in the way they worked together. Then there was also Urho Kekkonen of Finland. He was not a social democrat, but came from a liberal centrist political background. In 1969, he began negotiations to host a European peace conference to establish a framework for lasting peace and security in Europe. Kekkonen threw his support behind Ostpolitik on the condition of binding it into his foreign policy agenda and gaining the support of those who initiated and drove it. In return, Kekkonen used his influence and friendships in the Soviet Union to bind the Soviet Union deeper into the project as well. So Ostpolitik did not only succeed because Brezhnev was open to it. Ostpolitik was successful because the German government acted in mutually beneficial foreign policy cooperation with the governments and leaders of multiple European countries. What we learn here is that a foreign policy idea can have its chances for success dramatically increased if you find international partners to champion and cooperate in policy together. And another thing that is really important but often overlooked and underappreciated is this: hard work. Really hard work. Brandt, Schmidt, Palme, Kreisky, Kekkonen spent months of hours upon hours doing long, hard diplomatic work, negotiations, discussions, deliberations, formulating of treaties. This is important and should not be forgotten. Ostpolitik worked because those who proposed it were willing to do the difficult political work to make it succeed. But for now, we head to Poland. Well, actually, we head to France.